Hey everyone, welcome back to Grover Museum. Today we're going to be hitting the second part of the Blue River Trail, the central leg. So our first stop today brings us to the Blue River Trailhead. And as you can see behind me, we've got a replica of a train depot. And this is great for Shelbyville's history, because Shelbyville was actually the first community west of the Allegheny Mountains to have a train go through it. Now, how does it earn this title? Well, in 1832, a guy named Judge William Peaslee comes from Vermont to Shelbyville and settles down. This is just 5 years after the running of the B&O Railroad, the first chartered railroad in the United States. And possibly seeing the impact that a train industry can have on the local economy, Judge William Peaslee decides what he's going to do is try to get a train running through his new community as well. And what he does is he gets in touch with John Walker and John Hendricks, who are the founding fathers of Shelbyville, and gets their support behind him. And by getting their support, the investments start rolling in. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough investment happening or quickly enough to make it possible. And so what he does is they come up with this plan. And this plan is, let's get an experimental track. And what it'll do was, one, it'll allow the community to see sort of the impact that a railroad can have on their community. And two, the data from having to grade the land, from making cuts, the different embankments that are on it, the two bridges that have to be built, will provide data to the Lawrenceburg and Indianapolis railroad company, and convince them that, you know what, this is a really great investment, we want to move through Shelbyville. And so the experimental train launches July 4th, 1834. And it's a huge success. The car itself is actually only able to hold 25 people, but reports say that there's 40 to 50 people getting on the train and being carried out to a picnic area and then back again. The support is overwhelming. And so you'd think, well, that's what brought the train here to Shelbyville. But actually it takes a few more years before the train actually ever arrives. This sort of project, the land where the train was at sort of stays open to the public for a couple more years, where anybody can hook up a wagon and their horse and kind of take a train ride on it, and then it sort of just falls into disuse. Our next stop brings us to the bridge that crosses over Blue River and leads us into Shelbyville and North Harrison. And this part of Shelbyville is pretty significant for a couple different reasons. One, this marked the first road that came into Shelbyville and connected Shelbyville to the Ohio River and to Indianapolis. At the same time, there were no bridges yet developed in Shelbyville for that first decade or so. In fact, this would have been known, or around this area would have been known as Walker's Ford, named after John Walker, who owned this section of town. Now, in 1833, Shelbyville sees one of the first, and maybe Shelby County sees one of the first bridges developed here. And this bridge sort of acts as the way to get from the northern location of Blue River to the southern part of Blue River and into Shelbyville. This bridge is pretty short-lived, and in fact, one newspaper article in the mid-1800s notes that there was no intentions to rebuild the destroyed bridge after it had been destroyed. So apparently Walker's Ford came back into use at least up until the end of the Civil War. After the Civil War, we actually see a new bridge develop, and this bridge would have been put in 1867, and it was first crossed by a guy named Lee Amson. This was used until 1937 when a new bridge came in. This bridge right here, this concrete one. And this bridge was actually part of the WPA and was built in conjunction to the courthouse. And the day that it opened, there was a huge celebration. In fact, Governor Clifford Townsend came into town, and they held a parade that went from the bridge to the courthouse to mark its opening. Our next stop brings us to the Shelbyville CocaCola bottling plant, and prior to it being built, this location actually served as John Walker's homestead. It was built in 1825. It was a 2-story brick house, and it didn't actually come down until the 1930s to make way for this plant here. Now, the bottling side of things here in Shelbyville has a pretty long history. It begins in 1875 with a guy named Frank Ream, who begins bottling mineral water on his porch on Broadway Street. From there, in 1911, he opens the Shelbyville Bottling Works, and then Augustus Ream opens up the first Coca-Cola factory on 4th Street. In the 1930s, he then transitions and brings this location into play. It's actually built by Rubush and Hunter, and they actually have a pretty long history themselves, these designers, these architects. Rubush also built the B.F. Swain House on Washington Street, as well as the Circle Theater, the Old City Hall, the Circle Tower, the Indiana Theater, and the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Indianapolis on Mass Ave. So while Shelbyville was known for being the first community west of the Alleghenies to have that train go through it, that train comes with a little asterisk. The train, the engine, was a horse-drawn carriage. The beams were oak beams, so kind of a far gap between what we know as trains today. The trains that we sort of know today don't actually come to Shelbyville until the 1850s, and it begins with the Shelbyville Lateral. From there, the Knightstown and Shelbyville line opens up, and this line wasn't well loved, I guess you could say. In fact, a proverbial story had went that you could get on the train in Carthage, that a man had gotten on a train in Carthage, said goodbye to his dog, and by the time that he got to Shelbyville, his dog was already waiting for him and greeted him as he got off the train. The next line that opened up was also one that really didn't have a lot of positive remarks about it, and that was the Rushville and Shelbyville line. A newspaper here actually reported that while no one had been killed on the train line, enough people had nearly starved to death because of the time that it took to get from Rushville to Shelbyville. Now, there were a number of lines that opened up in those early years and into the 1900s. But the one I really want to focus on is the one that sort of starts it all with Judge Peasley. It's that Lawrenceburg and Indianapolis line. That line was not finished until 1853. And what's really neat about it is there were reports that shanty towns were built along the line to build it, and those shanty towns were inhabited by Irish immigrants, and many of those Irish immigrants actually kind of took to Shelbyville in such a positive way that they made it their permanent home. Later on, this railroad, when it was finished, would connect Shelbyville to Indianapolis and then to Cincinnati as well, and you could take the whole line for $3. In 1930, this line is bought, and it becomes the New York Central line. next location brings us to the DavisByerly Table Factory. Opened in 1885, this factory quickly becomes one of the largest producers of tables, not just in Indiana, not just in the United States, but actually across the world. Also known as the Dinky, they have over 500 employees in their height, and sort of make quick work of needing a larger location. And that location is the one that I'm talking about back here, which would have been located on Elizabeth Street, and that's in 1894. A few short years later, they land one of their largest sales to a firm in London, England for 1,500 tables, which was sort of unprecedented. This was largely done in part by Charles Davis, who started as the shaving sweep on the production floor, and quickly works his way up, becomes the vice president of sales, and then eventually buys enough of a stake in the company that he becomes the president of the company, and the company becomes the DavisByerly Table Company. Under the name the DavisByerly Company, they are able to offer their employees health care, accidental insurance, and life insurance in the 1920s, which is sort of just unheard of at that time. Unfortunately, the company closes in 1938 and gives way to future industry. After the DavisByerly factory closed in 1938, the factories, they're purchased by Mrs. Hester Porter Fuller in hopes of sort of being a developmental ground for future industry. And at first it's thought that Mr. Enos Porter is going to take over the location with his steel company. Unfortunately, Mr. Porter passes away around the same time, and so the factories sit vacant for a few years. Around the same time, a new company comes into town, and that's the National Farm Machine. And they come around 1940. And in 1941, they land a sizable governmental contract that allows them to sort of grow their operation even further. And since they needed a new location, this was the perfect one on Elizabeth Street. So they take it over in 1943 and are here for about a decade until they leave in 1952. Now, the factory doesn't sit vacant very long in this time. In fact, this sort of marks the next chapter of Shelbyville's history, and so you can see our long history with the fiberglass industry and our insulation industry taking place right there. And this is when Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company comes into town. By the summer of 1953, they have well over 400 employees. In 1974, another company that produces insulation, another fiberglass company, comes into town, CertainTeed. And while they're there for just a short amount of time, they do their bit in the factory. And then in 1978, Knauf comes in and takes over the factory. They renovate and then expand the factory in 1980. A fire occurs in 2007, and that takes out sort of the Elizabeth Street plant. And so remodeling and rebuilding is needed. And the plant that you see behind me now comes as a result of that.